The woman deliberately didn't wear underwear. She approached the man, wanting to spend a passionate night with him. In that moment, she revealed one tattoo after another in her private areas, making it clear what she was implying without having to say a word. Unfortunately, he remained unmoved. He loved his wife deeply, which instantly killed her mood and she walked away. That man's name was Mason, a hired bodyguard. This time, his mission was to protect a journalist named Claire from potential threats while abroad. Unexpectedly, Mason's gentlemanly charm stole Claire's heart. Sadly, her feelings were unrequited, like flowers falling on careless waters. In fact, just a few days earlier, Mason's true profession was that of a renowned lawyer. His life was colorful and full of stories. Since childhood, Mason had always searched for the meaning of life. At home, he studied hard and passed into law school, only a step away from becoming a respected lawyer. However, Mason chose a different path. He believed life would be more meaningful if he experienced different walks of life. On impulse, he enlisted in the army, becoming a special operative and beginning the life of a soldier. During that time, Mason also found the love of his life, married her, and had a beautiful daughter. Everything seemed to be going perfectly, and Mason had finally found his purpose. But a tragic event shattered this peace. One day, Mason and his squad boarded a helicopter heading to Pania, tasked with assassinating the nation's dictatorial president. As soon as their chopper entered Pania's airspace, it was struck by a well-aimed rocket. The helicopter exploded instantly, except for Mason, who was rappelling down. Everyone in the squad was killed. After this incident, Mason left the army, returned home, and began a new life as a legal consultant. From the outside, his routine, working 9 to 5 and coming home to his family, seemed blissful. However, Mason alone knew how dry and monotonous it felt, leaving him disoriented. Fortunately, an old comrade reignited his hope. After leaving the service, Sebastian, his fellow soldier, had founded a private security company, which by now was generating 8-figure annual revenue. He wanted Mason to join him, though Mason secretly longed to return to that life. He hesitated because of his wife and daughter. Just then, Sebastian mentioned President Juan of Pania. Recently, a female journalist was scheduled to interview him, and she needed a bodyguard. Sebastian suggested Mason take the job. He could use the chance to eliminate Juan and avenge his fallen comrades. After much thought, Mason agreed, but he kept this from his wife, telling her he had a business trip. The journalist was none other than Claire, who had just won the International Editor Award, boosting her standing in the media industry. Juan invited Claire partly because of her influence, but also because he personally admired her. Together, Mason and Claire flew from the US to Pania. At the airport, Juan warmly greeted Claire, then escorted her to his presidential estate for the private interview. Meanwhile, Mason was thoroughly searched, disarmed, and reluctantly seated in the third row of the escort vehicle to guard Claire. As the convoy drove through a bustling street, a sudden explosion erupted on a bridge they were crossing. Armed soldiers swarmed from all sides, opening heavy fire on Juan's convoy. Any bodyguards who attempted to fight back were instantly killed. Amid the chaos, Mason regained his composure, jumped to the driver's seat, started the engine, and attempted to escape. Just then, an RPG flew toward them. Mason swerved sharply, narrowly avoiding disaster, though another vehicle in the convoy was destroyed in the blast. Terrorists pursued them with reinforcements. 2 jeeps blocked their path, front and back. Mason, relying on the sheer weight of his vehicle, rammed through and crushed the enemy's cars. Grabbing a pistol from a fallen guard, Mason shot down the remaining attackers, ensuring Juan and Claire's safety. After the battle, Mason retrieved his gear and weapons from the trunk. Juan stepped out to thank him, but Mason ignored him, preparing to escort Claire away. Leaving Juan behind, Juan pleaded with Mason to escort him back to the capital to stop an urgent coup. But Mason flatly refused. Claire, however, thought only of her interview. This was news of a lifetime. Mason couldn't care less and led her into the forest. Unexpectedly, Juan caught up, knowing he was safer following Mason. If Claire hadn't been present, Mason would have shot him dead on the spot. Mason then used a satellite phone to contact Sebastian for help. Sebastian tracked Mason's GPS location and dispatched the nearest security team for extraction. According to Sebastian's instructions, Mason led Claire eastward for 3 kilometers to a clearing where a helicopter would arrive. Meanwhile, Juan borrowed Mason's satellite phone to call his nephew, only to discover that his nephew was the one behind the coup. Juan also realized his nephew must have been lured by the Americans. though the reasons would become clear later. He wanted to return to the presidential palace to take control. But Mason refused to be involved and pressed on toward the extraction point with Claire. Soon, an armed helicopter appeared. 2 heavily armed men rappelled down. But strangely, the helicopter immediately flew off afterward. Realizing something was wrong, Mason quickly dragged Claire into the forest as the newcomers began their pursuit. Gunfire erupted as they chased Mason and Claire. Luckily, the attacker's aim was poor, and most shots missed. Up ahead, a river came into view. Mason led Claire across it, but the pilot immediately launched 2 missiles at them. But none of the shots hit the target. Mason reached the opposite bank of the stream, dropped the sniper rifle slung on his back, and aimed directly at the approaching helicopter. Focusing intently, he squeezed the trigger over and over until finally striking the pilot. With the helicopter down, 2 armed men were still chasing from behind, carrying advanced weapons. Knowing that a head-on fight would be unwise, Mason dashed into the forest to fight guerrilla style. Hiding behind a tree, he was soon discovered by one of them. At that critical moment, Mason suddenly leapt out and engaged in close combat. His strength was no longer what it used to be, and after a hard struggle, he barely managed to knock the man unconscious. Just then, the last armed pursuer appeared, pointing his gun at them and demanding the whereabouts of Juan. Before Mason could finish speaking, 2 gunshots rang out from afar. The armed man fell dead on the spot. The shooter was none other than Juan himself. Hearing the gunfire, Juan guessed that something had gone wrong and deliberately came to provide support. At this point, Mason began to suspect he had been betrayed by Sebastian. Meanwhile, Juan's nephew arrived at the scene to investigate, and Johann, the leader of the assassins, also rushed over. Johann's employer was extremely dissatisfied that Juan was still alive and causing trouble everywhere. Johann liked only one thing: eliminating Juan. Yet Johann was not weak. Seeing the situation, he knew his men had failed their mission. This was not the time for arguments. They had to find Juan and get rid of him, so that control of the country could be seized. Mason, realizing he could not easily return to the US, placed his hopes on Johann. Juan then led Mason and Claire to a tribal refuge deep in the jungle, where he was warmly welcomed by the people. He and the tribe's leader had long been close. Juan himself had once come from this very place. To the villagers, Juan was no dictator but a respected leader. He took Mason and Claire to wash off the dirt, then sat down for Claire's interview on camera. Through Juan's words, another version of his story emerged. He was not a dictator, but a leader who loved his people. The small country of Pinilla had a rare mineral resource coveted by the Americans. To secure mining rights, they began bribing officials and manipulating the government. Juan refused to let his country become a puppet of the US, so he stood up courageously. However, those who didn't know the truth resisted him, branding him a dictator. Even Juan's nephew had been seduced by the Americans into launching a military coup. Hearing this, Mason saw Juan in a new light. In fact, the downing of Mason's helicopter wasn't Juan's doing at all, but an American scheme staged to threaten Juan into compliance. Afterward, Juan was forced to sign an unfair oil contract. Mason and his team were nothing more than pawns. That evening, the 3 joined the villagers' feast, dancing with them, but Mason couldn't enjoy himself. He only wanted to go home. Along the way, he kept protecting Claire, and she began to develop feelings for him. Late at night, dressed in sleepwear, she invited him into her room, but he refused, unwilling to betray his wife. The night passed peacefully. The next morning, Juan visited Mason and Claire, asking for Mason's help to return to the capital and stop the coup. Mason refused, saying his duty was only to protect Claire. Juan's expression hardened as he questioned Mason. With so many missions, why was he sent here? And wasn't it strange that so many coincidences had happened, including the helicopter attack? Mason called Sebastian and confronted him. Unable to hide it anymore, Sebastian confessed. His employer wanted to exploit Mason's hatred for Johann, using him to kill Juan so Johann could seize power. Realizing he had been used, Mason wanted no part of it. He just wished to return home safely. He began packing, preparing to take Claire to the border and leave Pinilla. But Johann and his men arrived, forcing the 3 to flee. Johann then threatened the villagers, forcing Juan to come out. For their safety, Juan gave up escaping. Mason, with Claire, found 2 horses to flee. But he couldn't abandon Juan. He turned back, riding to rescue him. Johann pursued by car, firing at them. The white horse panicked. Claire was thrown to the ground, while Mason and Juan tumbled down a slope. Barely escaping, Claire was captured. Mason, unwilling to abandon her, plotted a rescue. Johann, surprisingly, agreed to help. During this time, Juan revealed much about American violence, including the truth about Mason's helicopter. It was Americans, not Juan, who caused the explosion. They had wanted Juan dead and staged everything. Mason called Sebastian with this revelation. Sebastian was shocked, barely able to believe it. Juan then brought Mason to an old friend. To save Claire, they needed his help. They lured Johann's men to a square, where a massive protest erupted, arranged by Juan's allies. In the chaos, Mason managed to rescue Claire. Reunited, the three headed to the presidential palace. Johann knew a secret passage leading straight to his office. But Mason ambushed him, held him at gunpoint, and persuaded him to abandon his foolish path. Just then, a pro-American general stormed in, shot Juan in the chest, and chaos erupted. Johann fought back, wearing a bulletproof vest, and killed the general. Unfortunately, Johann himself was fatally wounded. The gunfire drew soldiers from both sides. Fighting erupted fiercely in the narrow corridors. Outmatched, Juan, Mason, and Claire retreated through the secret passage. Along the way, Mason shot down 2 enemies. Johann guided them to a safe room. But the power was cut. Realizing it was unsafe, they fled again. Outside, fierce battles raged. Juan hid behind a pillar, while Johann fought Jan in hand-to-hand combat. Jan revealed the truth. He was behind the helicopter explosion. At a desperate moment, Claire struck Jan, saving Mason. Together, they rejoined the fight. Soon Sebastian arrived with reinforcements. Having learned the truth, he chose justice, siding with Mason. Under his support, Jan's entire squad was wiped out, and the conspiracy of his mysterious employer was exposed to the world. The movie ends here. Its title is Mission Freedom. If you found it exciting, comment 1. If you thought it was just average, comment 2. Thank you for watching. See you next time.